Hello, everybody. Good morning. All of you joining us here in Florida. I know maybe a couple from outside of Florida. This is Mike Murphy with FixUS and also Chief of Staff at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Thank you all for your interest in joining us today. We're really excited about this event. And the purpose of today's event is this is the first event that we are hosting as part of FixUS for FixUS Florida, where we're starting to build a local support group of supporters in Florida that want to be part of our FixUS effort. I am the national director of our national FixUS effort. And let me give you a little bit of background on the purpose and formation of FixUS before getting into the meat of today's program. So FixUS is a project of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. It was officially launched earlier this year in January, and its purpose is, it was born out of the committee's desire to address the debt, but a recognition that we may not be able to address the debt until we address some of the drivers of our polarization, our division, our growing distrust, dysfunction in our political system that is preventing us from dealing with a range of issues, including the debt, but many others. And so therefore, FixUS is not focused on the debt. It's actually focused on better understanding, bringing attention to, and working with many others to address the drivers of that polarization, division, and distrust and brokenness that many people feel within our political system. We are doing this through a variety of activities. I encourage people to go and check out fixusnow.org, where you'll find a lot of other information on what we're doing. We've been starting chapters in several other states as well, and really excited to get people interested and engaged in Florida. Just a couple quick highlights of what we're doing. We are bringing some better understanding and attention to the drivers of this problem, and we're doing that through research, events, and engagement. We're building groups of citizens and institutional leaders that want to draw attention to these causes in their communities. And we are drawing attention to and connecting people and building what solutions are going to be necessary to fix what ails our political system. And it's with that last point that I will bridge into the purpose of today's event. I'm really happy to have with us today Jeremy Gruber. Jeremy is someone I've become close with over the last few years. And Jeremy is a senior vice president of Open Primaries. And he's with us today to talk about an initiative that's on the ballot in this coming November, focused on electoral system reform and opening up our primaries to all voters. I'm going to let Jeremy talk about the details of that, but just as a little more of a quick table setter, you know, at FixUS, we believe that there's numerous solutions that are necessary to fix what ails our political system. They're going to need political reforms, economic policy changes, civic initiatives, and engagement. But certainly one of the areas that many folks have looked at over the past few years is electoral system reform. And so what we want to do with FixUS is expose our supporters to a variety of the ideas that are out there on how we can fix our political system. And it's with that in mind that I was really pleased to invite Jeremy on, because there's something actually on the ballot that people are looking at and thinking about in Florida a lot. And so I thought it would be helpful to have Jeremy come on and talk about it. To be clear, FixUS does not as an organization specifically endorse or push specific pieces of legislation. But we think this is an important educational program to expose our supporters and build connections with those that may be interested in the work that Jeremy is doing with his efforts at Open Primaries. A couple of logistics before I hand it over to Jeremy to talk about the ballot initiative. We are recording this event today. We think that's really important because we are going to share this far and wide with our networks in Florida to build attention to our cause in the state as well as nationally. So just keep in mind we are recording this event. And please, we are wanting to have Q&A and engagement here as best as Zoom webinars can allow. Please use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen. Please use it. You can start right now. You can start typing in questions throughout when Jeremy's talking, and then we'll field as many questions as we can get to after Jeremy is done speaking. With that, it is my pleasure to hand it over to Jeremy. He's going to give a quick presentation overview of his efforts, and then we'll have Q&A. Jeremy, thank you, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank FixUS for having me on. I'm going to be talking about Amendment 3, which will be on the November ballot in Florida, the All Voters Vote Open Primary initiative. And like Mike said, I'm going to be giving a short presentation, but I really do encourage your questions afterwards. So, any discussion about Amendment 3, the Open Primaries initiative that will be on the Florida ballot this November, has to begin with independent voters. 30 years ago, most Americans were members of one of the two major parties. That has changed dramatically across the country. There has been a massive realignment of voter affiliation with both parties, Republicans and Democrats, losing members as more and more Americans register independent. That's being driven primarily, but not exclusively, by younger voters. Millennials, which are now the largest group of voters in the country, are over 50% independent, and Gen Zers, who are now entering the voting pool, are often even more independent than millennials. So we're seeing not just an overall change in voter affiliation, but we're seeing a significant change between younger voters and older voters in terms of how they view the parties and membership. That is particularly highlighted in Florida. And the All Voters Vote Open Primaries Initiative, Amendment 3, would not be possible, would not be moving forward without the incredible growth of independent voters in the state of Florida. 30 years ago, independent voters were 8% of registered Florida voters, 8%. As you can see, that's been growing dramatically ever since. They are now over 3.6 million registered NPA voters. Florida characterizes them NPA, independent voters in the state of Florida. That's 27% of all registered voters. And perhaps most significantly, that rate of growth is so high that within 10 years, independent voters are expected to become the largest group of voters in the state of Florida at 35%, eclipsing both major parties. Sorry, let's stay there. And yet, one of the most important effects of registering independent in the state of Florida and in other states is the fact that as a registered independent voter, you are denied access to primary elections in the state of Florida. You cannot vote in the primary as a registered independent. You are forced to wait until the general election. Now that matters not just because every American should have a right to vote in a publicly financed election. And of course, primaries in the state of Florida, like every state, are public elections. They are paid for by the taxpayers. But they have a significant effect because primary elections in Florida and around the country are often the only elections that matter. We have been in a 20-year decline in terms of competitive elections in this country. In the state of Florida, 47% of state legislative races are uncontested. That means that when you go into the general election as a voter, in 47% of races, you will only see one candidate on the ballot, only one. 16% of races are considered competitive, only 16%. That means that the real choices, the real decision-making in terms of voter choice is happening in the primary elections. And in the state of Florida, a third of registered voters are not allowed to participate. Florida is one of only 12 states left in the country that prohibit independent voters from participating at any level of the primary election process. As I said, they are now in the small minority of states that let independent voters be essentially second-class citizens. They pay taxes like every other member of the registered voting pool, but they are banned from the first round of elections. Now, this has been an issue in the state of Florida for many years. 20 years ago, Florida voters recognized that independent voters were starting to grow. Banning them from primary elections was hurting the overall electoral process, let alone the fact that it was actually disenfranchising growing numbers of Floridians. And so Florida voters 20 years ago passed a more limited version of an open primary. In the case of the primary that they passed, it worked like this. If in the primary, only one party was fielding candidates, meaning that there wasn't a Republican primary and a Democratic primary, but only, say, a Republican primary. That primary would become in essence, the general election, because whoever wins that primary is going to win the general election. And so they opened up primaries in those cases to independent voters. What happened very quickly, unfortunately, is that both parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, discovered a write-in loophole. What they started to do was field candidates that would write in their names into the general election. And by so doing, they closed the primaries. Primaries that would have been otherwise opened to independent voters because only one party was fielding candidates were then closed because an additional candidate wrote their name in to become on the general election ballot. And that's happening all across the state of Florida in many, many elections. Most recently gained a lot of attention in St. Johns County in the sheriff's race. A sheriff's race, which shouldn't quite frankly be a partisan race to begin with, where a candidate who had never had any law enforcement experience whatsoever had their name written in, raised a little bit of money, wrote their name in, and closed the election to independent voters. So the need to address open primaries in a more comprehensive way has been clear as a result of both parties trying in every way to keep them closed. Sorry. Now, what does it mean to have an open primary versus closed primary? Right now in the state of Florida and other states with closed primaries, you as a voter who is participating in a Republican primary or a Democratic primary have very few choices. You can vote for your party's candidates. You can't vote for the other party's candidates. And sometimes that matters. You may, for example, find a candidate as a Democrat or Republican you like from the other party, like the sheriff's race I just mentioned. You are siloed as a Republican and a Democratic voter in a closed primary. Of course, independent voters, as I've talked about, are disenfranchised, and that's increasingly meaning younger voters who are overwhelmingly independent. Voter participation stays low because you're excluding a third of registered voters from participating. And perhaps most importantly, in terms of how our political system works, only the most partisan voters in each party tend to participate in the primaries. Well, what does that mean? It means that you as a candidate, you're not really responsible to your entire electorate. Because most elections are uncompetitive, you in most districts know you're going to be elected if you are a member of a party that's in the majority. So that means that you're only responsive to the most partisan voters in your party in order to get elected and stay in office. It creates, incentivizes candidate behavior, politician behavior that is responsive only to the fringe of one party or the other and not to the entire electorate. And it really gets in the way of bipartisanship and the collective good on behalf of the voters. What would an open primary do in the state of Florida? Well, first and foremost, it would let 3.5 million people, think about that, 3.5 million voters who are registered to participate in the primary on day one. That in and of itself should be enough, but it does a lot more. It engages young people by bringing them into the process. As I talked about in a closed primary and an open primary, it incentivizes candidates to work together because now they're being responsive to their entire voting public, not just the partisan few. It gives solution making a priority over partisanship. It allows every voter to pick the best candidate, and it ends taxpayer funding of private elections. Right now, closed primaries in the state of Florida are taxpayer funded. Like I said, you as a voter experience the primary the same as you would the general election. You go into the same voting booth with the same poll workers. It's administered by the state. And yet the parties get to choose who can participate and who can't, all at the taxpayer's expense. So what does Amendment 3 do? Amendment 3, it creates a top-two open primary. First and foremost, it lets all voters vote in primary elections for all statewide offices, all legislative offices, governor, cabinet, regardless of party affiliation. All candidates are on this one ballot. There is no Republican primary. There is no Democratic primary. There's one primary. It's a public primary, taxpayer funded. All the candidates with their party affiliation are on the ballot. Every voter gets to vote for the best candidate, regardless of party. The top two vote getters move on to the general election, and then you have a regular general election of the way you would currently. And it, of course, allows a public election to be what it should be, open to every voter to choose the best candidate. Sorry. 3 states already use this form of an open primary: California, Washington, and Nebraska. And it's important to see what happens in these states. We now, California, for example, has had a top-two primary since 2012 was the first election cycle they started using it. Nebraska actually was the creator of the top-two primary. They've been using the top-two primary for 85 years for state legislative races. What you find in both states is a huge increase in productive legislating. California went, for example, from one of the least productive legislatures in the country before adopting a top-two open primary to one of the most productive legislatures. You see bipartisanship across the board in the states with open primaries. You see very high legislative approval compared to other states because voters, whether they're in a Republican-dominated district or a Democratic-dominated district, are seeing their legislators being much more responsive to them, even if they are of another party from that elected member. And you see huge support from voters. So California, for example, they've had a top-two since 2012, 60%. Every year, around 60% of voters are polled and 60% approve of the top-two open primary. If you're in Florida, you've actually already used the top-two open primary. Most local elections around the country, more than 80% of American cities use top-two open primaries, including Florida. Around the state, from Pensacola to the southern tip of Florida, you see widespread use of nonpartisan top-two primaries in local elections. They're the norm. And polls of Floridians actually find that Floridians often prefer the effects of the outcomes of their local elections far more than the outcomes of their statewide races. They've been using local nonpartisan primaries for years. They work, and they're widely supported. So I'm happy to talk more, answer your questions. I think we're going to show a quick video of the campaign that's unfolding, and I'll let you take it away.
an independent voter. Independiente.
I'm a Democrat.
I'm a Republican.
We don't see eye to eye on everything.
But here's something that just makes sense. When we have elections, every registered voter should have the right to vote.
There are 3.5 million voters in Florida like me who don't belong to a political party, and we can't vote in the primaries. 90% of races are decided in the primaries, and my tax dollars pay for them, but independents can't vote. That's just not fair.
Plus, the current system is not just bad for her, but it limits choices for Democrats like me.
And Republicans like me. I want to vote for the best candidate in the primaries, even if they're not from my party.
That's why we're voting yes on Amendment 3 this November. Amendment 3 lets all voters vote in an open primary. It's simple, it's fair, and should be the law.
So when it comes to improving Florida, the time has come to let all voters vote. Vote yes on Amendment 3.
Let all voters vote. Vote yes on Amendment 3.
Let all voters vote. Vote yes on Amendment 3. Dejar que todos los votantes voten.
So you can go to floridaopenprimaries.org for a lot more detail and information. But again, I'm happy to answer everybody's questions, and please bring it on.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeremy, for that presentation. That was a really helpful overview. We've got several folks typing in questions. Anyone else that wants to type in questions, please feel free to do so. I'm going to try and sometimes combine questions and comments into one if we can do that, and they all make similar themes. I'm going to combine a couple here. We had one that was sent in from Shelley in Lakeland, who's basically asking, can you cite any drawbacks that are cited to Measure 3? And then I think in the comments and questions, some folks were posting a couple of, I think, some of those examples potentially, you know, in terms of the critiques of this idea. So I want to give you the opportunity to respond to those. You know, one of them is an argument about individual choice, and voters should get to choose the membership of their party affiliation. That's a common criticism. I'll let you respond to that. Similarly, the parties are private organizations and should vet their own candidates. So I guess a little combo there, Jeremy. Those are some of the more, I know, common critiques people mention on this, and to Shelley's broad question, are some drawbacks here or common criticism to this effort?
No, those are great questions. In terms of limitations of Amendment 3, I think the main limitation is its effect. So the state of Florida has one of the strictest single subject rules in the country. So in order to get Amendment 3 on the ballot, it can only address statewide races. It does not affect federal races. So elections for members of Congress would not be affected by Amendment 3. Those would continue with the same closed partisan ballot that's already been in effect. It would have required a whole second campaign of ballot gathering and cost in order to address that. So Amendment 3 does not cover every elected office, but it covers the state legislature, covers all statewide offices, and I think it'll have a very direct and significant effect right away. In terms of the question about party membership, I think that's a really important question because this is not a question of letting voters vote in a party primary. What a Top-Two primary does is it eliminates party primaries. There is no Republican primary or Democratic primary. Parties are have an absolute First Amendment right to choose who their members are, and Amendment 3 does not affect that at all. Parties can continue to select their candidates in whatever fashion they choose, if they want, however they want to do that, but they can't do that at the taxpayer expense anymore. This Top-Two Open Primary, like and other states have enacted, this creates a public primary. So there is no longer a Republican primary or a Democratic primary. You are no longer choosing party candidates. You are choosing the front runners that will go on to the general election. And quite frankly, that's how most voters think of the primaries, is picking the front runners. But you're not picking the Republican Party candidate or the Democratic Party candidate. Candidates are on the ballot with their party affiliations, and the parties get to decide how that is designed. All the Top-Two does is it eliminates the silos of party primaries by creating a public primary financed by public taxpayer dollars, where all the candidates are on the ballot and all the voters vote. It's a winnowing election. It is not an election to choose party candidates.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for the questions coming in there. Folks, feel free to type in more questions. I'll go to the next one. Ricardo asks, are there, quote, best arguments, unquote, to convince Democrats or Republicans on this idea, right? This won't pass even if the 3 million independents, non-affiliated, et cetera, vote for it. So I get the question is, arguments here, somewhat messaging a little bit perhaps. I mean, what are you seeing there, Jeremy, as the best arguments to convince those that are Democrats, Republicans on this?
Well, I think there's two arguments. One is a voter-centric argument, and one is a party-centric argument. I think the voter-centric argument for Democrats or Republicans is that it gives you actual choice, particularly if you're a Democrat or Republican in a district that is overwhelmingly populated with folks from the other party. If you're a Republican right now in Florida in a democratically dominated district, your vote doesn't matter at all. The Democrats are nominated, Democrats are elected, and they're not going to listen to you whatsoever. The same thing for the other party. In a Top-Two primary, it forces elected officials to be responsive to everybody in their district, regardless of party. So you as a voter get heard, regardless of where you live in the state. And secondly, it offers you as a voter full choice. A party primary limits your choice. So you as a voter, as say a Republican, in a Republican primary, you only get to choose Republican candidates. Now that may not matter to you when you're choosing governor or even state legislator, but what about sheriff? Do you really care about the party affiliation of your sheriff, or do you want to elect the best sheriff? Party primaries don't prohibit party members themselves from choosing the best candidate regardless of party. And quite frankly, for the parties themselves, if you are have a particularly strong party affiliation, the truth is that independent voters are going to be the largest group of voters in the state. They're already almost 30% of voters. And their exclusion from the elections is creating a dysfunction that's affecting everyone in the state, Republican, Democrat, and independent. It's creating a legislature that is more and more dysfunctional because it's more and more responsive to the fringe of the parties and not to the majority of Floridians who just want to see a legislature that's doing the people's work productively. And finally, I think the more that you bring in independents into the process, the more I think it benefits the parties. The parties are losing members. That's a long-term trend. If you really believe in your party, then you should, in my estimation, want to and support a system that brings all voters into the system that's only going to be healthier for the parties. Keeping a third and growing voters out of the system is only going to accelerate the demise of the parties. It's already happening, and it's absolutely assured unless every voter is brought into the system and treated equally.
Susan in Miami-Dade County asks, who opposes these types of reforms and why? I think we probably already touched on some of that, but who opposes these reforms and why? Do Democrats disfavor it more than Republicans? Can you speak to that a little bit, Jeremy?
You know, it's funny. You know, some reforms tend to be favored by one party or the other. We like to say at Open Primaries, we're one of the few bright spots of bipartisanship in Florida and other states because the insiders of both parties don't like us. They don't like open primaries. Why? Because open primaries transfer power from the party insiders to the voters. And that's not just independent voters, that's all voters, Democrats and Republican voters. You know, you're starting to see a wider and wider divide on the issue of opening the system between the party insiders who like to be able to control the system. They like to know who the candidates are going to be. They like to keep the elections uncompetitive. so that they know who's going to be elected in a particular office well ahead of time. Here's one big thing that happens in an open primary. Competition goes up. Competition should be something that anybody would want in a democratic system. In California, for example, they had a 40% rate of uncontested elections prior to adopting open primaries. They now have a 1% rate of uncontested elections. That creates, quite frankly, a lot of unpredictability into this situation. That's what democracy is supposed to be, unpredictable. But the party insiders like control, they like predictability, and that's why you're seeing a wider and wider divide between the party insiders and the party members themselves, Democrats and Republicans, regular voters, who simply want to see productive legislatures that are being responsible, that are doing good work, and that are listening to the voters, all the voters, in a way that treats everybody equally. That's, quite frankly, what most voters want, regardless of party affiliation. That's not what the party insiders want, from both parties. And they, in fact, sued to try to get Amendment 3 off the ballot for that very reason. They lost, and Amendment 3 will be on the ballot. Now it's going to be up to the voters to decide, Democrats and Republicans as well as independents, whether they want an open system that treats everybody fairly and equally and puts pressure, real pressure, on the politicians to be productive, to not simply be responsive to the partisan few, and to govern for everybody.
Couple questions that you touched on for sure in the presentation, we can kind of elaborate on. It's about outcomes, right? And other states that have tried this, right? So I think that so Kyle Sarasota asks, have other states tried this? What has the outcome been? Another question, sort of just dug in on the California one and the Q&A here about, you mentioned California, and the question was, hasn't the result of that top two been that it's basically shut out the Republican Party and pushed the Democratic Party to be more extreme? The question. I mean, so I guess use this to kind of dig in a little bit on the experience of this in other states. You know, from my perspective, Jeremy, as I've always thought about this, and I think we've talked about before, you know, the drawing that line from A to Z that kind of shows, oh, these sort of primary reforms actually change the incentives to show that then X, Y, and Z happen is a hard thing to do. But I'm curious, elaborate on sort of the outcomes here as you've seen them in other states, probably, I guess, particularly in California, given that question, in terms of how this really improves the climate.
So look, the Republican Party has been on a decline in California, and it was on a long decline long before it adopted Top-Two. Top-Two has not hastened that in any stretch, for any stretch of the imagination. To the question about what it has actually moderated the Democratic Party. If you can imagine what the Democratic Party in California might have been like without Top-Two, what's happened as a result of Top-Two, one of the sort of unique features of Top-Two is that in some districts that are overwhelmingly dominated by one party or the other, you can on occasion see two members of the same party come out of the primary. Some folks think, well, that's strange. That seems like it might limit choice. It actually is quite the opposite. Because imagine what would happen in a Democratic district today without a Top-Two primary, a district that every election cycle elects a Democrat. Well, sure, a Republican can be nominated and be on the ballot, but they're never going to be elected. In those types of districts, because of the Top-Two primary, you'll see two candidates of the same party. That puts incredible pressure on the party to moderate itself, to produce candidates that reach out to the entire district, not just members of their own party, in order to be elected. And what we've seen in California is a huge growth in moderate Democrats as a result of Top-Two in those districts where you see same party races. The irony, of course, of the issue of sort of same party races is that one of the unique features of the Top-Two, because it increases competition so dramatically, is that in the Top-Two, same party races go up in incredible numbers. California has more same party races as a percentage than any other state in the country as a result of the Top-Two system, because you start to see competition. The parties stop sort of dividing up districts based upon who has a predominant number of voters in that district. And so you actually start to see almost zero uncontested elections, and you start to see a lot more Republican versus Democrat contests as a result. In Nebraska, similarly, you have one of the more productive legislatures in the country. Nebraska likes to pride itself. You have state delegations actually come through Nebraska to witness their state legislature because it's one of the most productive legislatures in the country. It's 73% Republican. Nebraska, like a number of states in that region, is a predominantly red state. But Democrats hold chairmanships of committees. Their bills are regularly come up for votes. And that's because, as compared, for example, to their neighbor Kansas, which has a closed system, you see a tremendous amount of bipartisanship in the state of Nebraska, as compared to Kansas, which has, for all intents and purposes, a very similar demographic. And yet the system itself in Nebraska lends itself to a very different political culture, one that is far more inclusive of the voters and far more productive legislating occurs.
Trying to get in one or two more here in the time we have left. This is a different question. I don't think has been addressed. It's relevant, I think, to this reform idea. Elisa or Elisa, I'm not sure what it is. I apologize for not getting pronunciation of first name right. But she asks, she's not sure if this question has been addressed, but what about members of one party trying to skew the election by way of joining together to kind of vote in a primary in sort of ways that might sort of support a worse candidate, et cetera? Has this happened to significant amounts in other states? Has this tended to happen? I think you know what she's getting at there, Jeremy, right? Like basically the parties getting cute in terms of how they manipulate potentially how they vote in some of these primary systems to kind of affect.
So that you know, that's sort of one of the myths, the sort of the big myths around open primaries, that somehow there'll be sabotage. Party members will try to game the system and vote for somebody that they think is weak in order to advantage their party in the general election. Well, it doesn't happen. And there's been many studies of the phenomenon. They've all shown it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen for various reasons. One, voters really actually care about their vote. And they vote for who they think is the best candidate, and they're not willing to trade that vote to participate in a type of sort of shenanigan like you described, Mike. The other thing is it's very hard to organize voters that way and to create an outcome like that. You know, it's funny. This got a lot of attention in this last primary cycle in South Carolina. In South Carolina, if you recall, President Trump and a number of right-wing pundits were actually encouraging what they called Operation Chaos, right? It was, in their view, the largest, most organized attempt to determine the outcome of an open primary in South Carolina. You know what? Didn't happen. It was more attention and money was poured into trying to sort of trick the system. Doesn't work. It didn't work in South Carolina, and it just doesn't work. Certainly not in the type of numbers that would be required to be determinative of election. So, you know, it's a myth. It just doesn't happen. The numbers of voters that would have to be organized in order for it to matter is almost impossible to make happen. Voters just don't want to participate that way. And it's a good narrative to try to tear down an open primary. But, you know, the truth is that Florida is one of only 12 states with a closed primary. That means that 38 states have figured out how to run an open primary effectively without the type of sabotage that is continually raised as a block to try this. So 38 states can figure it out. I'm fairly confident Florida can figure it out too.
We'll go one more question. Ricardo came in, one more question. the impact on participation by non-major party candidates. I don't know if I can't remember if you touched on that already, but like, has there been an impact of the ability for these non-major party candidates to participate in these types of primaries around the country?
Well, to be clear, you know, Measure 3 is about voters. It can't reform the entire electoral process of it in all by itself. I think it does. It's a very effective first step. So, what you do see in the type of primary that Amendment 3 envisions is you do see a lot more room for candidates to come forward who, not just third-party candidates, but party candidates who might have been shut out by the party insiders, have a lot more freedom to come forward. You know, the Democrats just put forward a vice presidential candidate, Kamala Harris. She was elected in a top-2 primary. She came both as a senator and previously as attorney general. She came to that position not having been a party insider, but she was able to get elected in a top-2 system because candidates have a lot more freedom to go right to the voters and build support rather than try to go through sort of the smoke-filled back rooms of the party, sort of the party insiders who in more closed systems get to choose the candidates who come forth. So you have a lot more freedom, not just for third-party candidates, but for party candidates who are more unconventional, more independent of the party, of sort of the party leaders. And I think that's a really important feature of the system. It benefits new types of candidates, and it certainly benefits the voters and giving them more choice of the types of politicians they get to put into office.
Great, Jeremy. Well, with the minute we have left here, I want to thank everyone for joining. I'll wrap us up here in a second, but I want to give you the chance, Jeremy, to kind of offer any kind of wrap-up concluding remarks, and also please feel free to direct people where they should go again for more information about this amendment.
Sure, you can go to floridaopenprimaries.org to learn more about the amendment. Please get involved, volunteer. We need everybody to support this amendment. We really hope that you'll not just support it yourself, but talk to your friends and family, create some debates, have some discussions. This is the type of amendment that could really transform politics in the state of Florida, not just enfranchising millions of voters and giving everyone real choice, but really starting to affect how politics is done in Tallahassee, how government runs, and how policy is created for all the people, not just the handful of insiders that are currently getting to pick who gets elected and how they act in office.
Great. Well, I will quickly wrap us up by thanking you, Jeremy, again for joining us and provide this information, everybody, today. I thought it was really helpful. I thought it was a really good discussion. A lot of good questions there to kind of dug into the meat of some of this. So I also want to thank everyone for joining us here live, and we look forward to engaging with folks more in Florida on our FixUS effort. I again point people to fixusnow.org to learn more about FixUS and our efforts nationally, as well as what can be done in Florida. So with that, thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.